alternating between that and Revelation. So we've looked at stewardship in terms of the fact that we need to offer God our time, our talents, and our treasure. And we've seen the biblical perspective on that. Today, we're going to be looking at stewardship of the environment. And I want to pose the question, can a Christian be an environmentalist? Because a lot of the environmentalist movement has been hijacked by a very ungodly agenda. And so they've got themselves into the news for all the wrong reasons, taken very extreme positions. There we have some climate change activists chucking soup on the Mona Lisa, sort of a treasure. Okay, in the Louvre, I've been there, seen it. It was a lot smaller than I expected it. But when I was there, they didn't have to put the glass in front of it to protect it from the soup being thrown on it by environmentalists, somehow trying to make some point. And in 2022, we had some last generation activists throwing mashed potatoes on a Monet painting in a museum in Germany, and then they glued themselves to the wall below. It's the kind of stupid antics they come up with. And of course, there's been a lot of public debate about that because of their disregard for public property and art. I don't think they win many people to their cause when they chuck soup on the Mona Lisa. They've also blocked traffic in order to draw attention to their supposed climate change issues. And protesters they've sat in intersections, whilst they've even glued themselves to the pavement. Some of them had to have themselves surgically removed by doctors. They've caused traffic jams, made people late for appointments. But of course, one of the most infamous incidents was in Berlin, where a cyclist who was involved in the accident actually died because the ambulance was delayed due to one of their protests. And so there was a lot of public outrage due to that. They've targeted businesses, vandalized storefronts, sprayed paint on luxury brands. And so just to give a few examples, a Rolex store in London was blasted with orange paint. I'm not too sure exactly what they got against Rolex. Fossil fuel companies, their offices have been targeted. Banks have also been targeted. And these are the kind of people that President Trump will call the radical left lunatics. Okay, but despite that, Christians are called to care for creation in a way that honors God. You know, often when we have these sort of extremes, we go to the opposite extreme. It's kind of like the prosperity movement. When people harp on about prosperity all the time, sometimes we go to the opposite extreme. And when people, harp on about positive confession, you go to the other extreme and think that you need to be negative. You don't need to be negative. If you're a Christian, and all this sort of nonsense that we get on these extreme fringes shouldn't make us throw the baby out with the proverbial bathwater. So it's true, as I say, that much of this movement has been hijacked by anti-Christian globalist agendas. We'll see later on how some of the stuff is, directly anti-Christian, but that doesn't let us off the hook. Okay, we shouldn't be guilty of polluting. We're going to see abusing God's good creation due to selfish choices, greed, and apathy. So biblical stewardship is not about radicalism. It's about responsibility. It doesn't mean we idolize nature and we don't adopt these extreme positions, but we do have to be wise and take care of creation. We'll see this is what the Bible teaches. And so we can engage in sustainable practices, ethical resource use, conservation efforts as an act of worship and obedience. Now, to remind you, and this is something we've seen in all the stewardship, all that we've been given, remember our time, our treasure, our talents, well, it's the same with the earth. We've been given stewardship, we'll see, but it's not our property. It belongs to God. We are just managers. Psalm 24, 1-2, the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. So the earth by rights of the fact that he's the creator, belongs to God. It's his property. And remember, like the vineyard in Jesus' parable, where he gives the servants the trust to look after the vineyard, we have also been made the proprietor. We've been charged with tending his garden, and so we owe him a positive return on his investment. And so in Genesis 2 verse 15, we're told that God took Adam and put him in the Garden of Eden to do what? To work it and take care of it. Remember, I told you that work isn't part of the curse, as some people say. Work got harder because of the curse. But right in the beginning, before the fall, man and woman were given a job, and their job was to work the garden and to take care of it. So even then, in the ideal paradise, things didn't just, by themselves naturally, grow nicely. They had to cultivate it. They had to water it and take care of it. Now, the Hebrew word for work there it's actually avad, because sometimes the B and the V in the Hebrew, those who've done the course will know that the B and the V is exactly the same letter with the dot difference. We say abad, it's actually avad. It may also be translated cultivate. And the Hebrew word that we translate take care of is shema, which means watching over something, guarding and preserving it. And so if you couple those two words together, the first couple are told to cultivate, to watch over, tend the garden, and neither usage allows for plunder, exploitation, or abuse. And so the fact that we've been given dominion over the earth doesn't mean that we're free to pillage or abuse the earth's resources, because dominion involves responsibility and accountability. God has given us a mandate to take care of the world, and we need to find ways of putting back into nature at least as much as we take out of it. Any good farmer knows that a fertile field will ultimately become barren if they don't find some way to maintain and replenish the soil, put back the nutrients and the water that you're taking out of it. And in the same way, industry, it supplies our needs, but it should act responsibly and doing what it can to preserve natural resources in the process. Now, here's an interesting passage, Revelation 11:18. We've still got to get there in our Revelation study, but it says, the nations were angry and your wrath has come. The time has come for judging the dead and for rewarding your servants, the prophets, and your people who revere your name, both great and small, and for destroying those who destroy the earth. Now, when you read that, you might think, well, destroy the earth, it's referring to the system of the world. But that Greek word there, the pronunciation of the koine is gay, although they don't pronounce it like that in modern Greek. But it actually is not a reference to the world system, it's a reference to the actual land, the soil. Those who destroy the earth. Young's literal translation says to destroy those who are destroying the land. John doesn't use the word cosmos when he's talking about the world system, when, the evil world system as well. And also the fact that God so loved the world that he gave his son, that's cosmos. But this is a different word and actually refers to the physical land. And it's part of God's punishment is for destroying those who destroy the earth, the land. Interesting. The Greek lexicon defines it as earth, land, ground, soil. And if you just go look it up like a good Bible student, you'll be able to find how it's translated elsewhere. Look how it's translated elsewhere, just in the KJV. Earth, land, ground, country, world, earthly. So that word, when it talks about God destroying those who destroy the earth, is talking about the physical earth. And so God created the plant kingdom, we are told, and he deemed it good. I won't read the whole passage there, you know it. He created all the vegetables, the trees, and all the plants bearing seed, it says, and God said that it was good. And we are told that God cares for nature. Jesus said, see how the flowers of the field grow. He's talking about wild flowers, saying they don't labor or spin, and yet not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. Jesus said, if that is how God clothes the grass of the field. Now, obviously, he's making a point that we're more important than the grass of the field, but he's saying that God takes care of the grass of the field, the wild flowers. It's important to God. The Israelites were instructed by God to use ecologically sensitive practices in farming. They had to rest their land every 7th year. Just as we need rest, so the land needs rest. And if you read in Leviticus 19, you'll find that they weren't to eat the fruit of newly planted trees for 5 years until the trees had time to mature. And I put the references in there. I won't read them out now for the sake of time. And so stewardship of the environment means we need to use our resources wisely, ensuring that forests and lands are managed sustainably rather than exploited recklessly. We don't just chop down trees everywhere and burn them for firewood and not plant new trees. Do you know that the Israelites were prohibited from chopping trees down even when they were besieging their enemies? Maybe they wanted to use them for knocking the door, the door of the city down, or some sort of a battering ram, but they were told not to chop the trees down. And that shows a principle of conservation, what we call conservation. If you don't believe me, here it is. Deuteronomy 20:19, when you besiege a city for a long time, making war against it in order to take it, you shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them. You may eat from them, but you shall not cut them down. Are the trees in the field human, that they should be besieged by you? So a bit of humor there as well. If you read Deuteronomy 23, verse 12 to 13, go look it up. I didn't put it in there. But God requires the Israelites to curb pollution. He gives them instruction on proper disposal of waste products. And so we can apply this principle by reducing waste, recycling, advocating for clean water and air. There's nothing wrong with those things. They're not evil just because we've got some lunatics who lie in the street and throw soup on the Mona Lisa. So overconsumption and wastefulness contradict biblical stewardship. We need to live responsibly, sustainably, and that aligns with the fact that we honor God's creation and we're good stewards of what belongs to God, and he has just told us to take care of it, just as he told Adam and Eve to work the garden. Then what about animals? Stewardship of animals. We know that God created the marine life, the bird kingdom, and all the animals that inhabit the earth. And once again, he not only deemed it good, he pronounced a blessing on it. I'm not too sure why my computer keeps going ahead of itself, yeah? God said, let the water teem with living creatures, let birds fly across the sky. Goes on to say not only that God saw that it was good, it says God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number. So God wanted animals to increase in number. They're part of his creation. And not only the birds and the animals in the sea, the same pattern we see is repeated for the land animals, the wild and the domesticated. Okay, God, it said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock. So he's talking about domesticated in the sense that livestock you look after, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals. And God saw that it was good. Not only good, we to look after it. Because we were made in God's image. Unlike other creatures, we have been given the responsibility for looking after God's creation, for being good stewards. Genesis 1 verse 26, God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule, have dominion over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals and over all the creatures. So here we see God also not only tells Adam to look after the garden, Adam and Eve, by the way, he tells both male and female as well, that they have dominion over all the domesticated and the wild animals. So God created mankind in his own image, it says in Genesis 1. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. So women aren't excluded. And of both male and female, it says God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Subdue has the implication of us taking dominion over, ruling it, taking responsibility. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. We have dominion and stewardship over the animals. And once again, it's not about exploitation, it's about care and responsibility. Psalm 8:6-8 says, you have given him, that's mankind, dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. So again, reaffirming the fact that man is unique. That's one of the differences as well with a lot of the environmentalists, is they try to say we just, because of evolution, a highly evolved creature, and we're not really any different, and we've got no more, rights than an animal. The difference with biblical environmentalism is man has a unique position in that he's given responsibility, but not to abuse, because they're not our property, they belong to God, the animals. Psalm 50:10-11 says, every beast of the forest is mine, that's God's. The cattle on 1,000 hills, I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine. Okay, so you just think your dog is yours. Okay, it's actually God's dog, you just got to look after him. God further shows this principle of caretaker in telling Adam to name the animals. By relegating that authority, God shows firstly personal interest. He has to give the animals names. And also he's showing his desire that, Adam, you take responsibility for them. You name them. God didn't even give the animals their names. He told Adam to do that. And by analogy, if you think about it, when you get a pet, you give it a name. That's the first thing you do. And you demonstrate your affection and also the fact that you're now assuming responsibility for that animal. And so it's quite an important thing, giving something a name. We do it too. And we find a similar stewardship role given to Noah. Firstly, God commands Noah to preserve in the ark 2 of every living kind of every kind of living creature. Remember, it's 7 of the clean. And the command's not qualified, so it included vermin and predators, part of God's creation as well. And so Noah has a stewardship role because he has to, for the time that they're in the ark, actually look after those animals, whatever it entailed. Not just those that serve and are profitable to people, even the wild animals. You might think, well, if you were Noah, maybe you had left some of the nasty ones out, like some of the snakes or something like that. But Noah had to look after all of them. And so nature and wildlife are valuable to God, independent of humanity. Before the flood, God ensured the preservation of both the wild and the domesticated animals by placing them in the ark. If you read this account, God actually brought the animals to Noah. And so once again, we see a principle of conservation. That's what modern conservation is, trying to make sure that animals don't go extinct needlessly. So there's nothing wrong with that, because if God didn't value that principle, then why did he bother to bring the animals and put them on the ark? They could have just all drowned in the flood. But God thought it was important to preserve animals from going extinct needlessly. The everlasting covenant after the flood that God makes, it's not just with Noah, it's with both animals and nature. They're all part of God's creation. So we think of it, as a covenant with man. It says here in Genesis 9, God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and listen to this, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, so his covenant's also with the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. And we find that pretty much reiterated over here in this passage as well. And I'm not going to read this whole passage, but the last part of that says, God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant I've established between me and all life on earth. The everlasting covenant is with all creation. Kate mentioned this in his ministry recently, that when God justifies his reluctance to destroy Nineveh, he mentions the animals as well, which is interesting. God was actually concerned about the fact that if he brought down a judgment on Nineveh because of their wickedness, the animals would be impacted because of the bad behavior of the humans. Jonah 4:11, should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people and also many animals? Why did God say that if animals weren't important to him? And it's quite interesting. I found that when Jonah reluctantly goes and preaches in Nineveh, saying that God is going to destroy the city in 40 days unless they repented, the king makes an interesting decree. Not only the people, he says, but even the domestic animals had to fast and be covered with sackcloth. So even the animals were fasting and covered in sackcloth. They probably didn't know why they were doing it, but it says here, by the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks, taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink, but let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. So these animals unwittingly had to join in the fast and also wear sackcloth. The prophet Hosea speaks of a covenant when he's addressing Israel. But once again, he mentions animals. Hosea 2:18, in that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, the birds in the sky and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land so that they may lie down in safety, because obviously war impacts not just man, but animals as well. So in the millennium, we're going to have a reign of peace. Now, just briefly, animals have more than incidental roles in the affairs of people, and we see this in the Bible. Part of Solomon's wisdom, it tells us in 1 Kings 4:33, was that he described plant life. So he actually, just as Adam named the animals, King Solomon was renowned for giving names to plant life, categorizing them, like a modern botanist might do. From the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also taught about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. So it was part of Solomon's wisdom, that he had concern for nature, both animals and plants, and also categorized them and gave them names. Job says that we can learn from the wisdom of animals. So we've got something to learn from animals. Job 12:7-9, ask the animals and they will teach you, or the birds of the sky and they will tell you, or let the fish in the sea inform you. Which of all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? Solomon says that we can learn about work ethic from the ant, the lowly ant. He says you can learn something from him because how hard he works. Go to the ant, you sluggard. A sluggard is a lazy person. He says, if you're lazy, go look at the ant. That tiny little creature has got a better work ethic than you. Consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. Sometimes we see in the Bible that God used animals for specific and even unusual purposes. And so Elijah, we know, is fed by the ravens. They're part of God's way of making sure that his prophet doesn't go hungry when he's in the wilderness. In the account of Balaam, one we're familiar with, God uses the donkey, not Balaam. It was the donkey that sees the angel and inadvertently saves Balaam's life because the angel's about to strike him down. And the donkey sees the angel and keeps on averting the angel. God used a whale, some say great fish, in order to save Jonah's life. And he uses a small fish to provide the money that Jesus and Peter need to pay the temple tax. And we're told that Jesus was even accompanied by wild animals, interestingly, when he was in the desert. Mark 1:13 says he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals. It's interesting. Why even mention that? Eh? He was with the wild animals, and angels attended him. Now, in one sense, humans are no different, in terms of mortality anyway. And so Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes, and remember the first part takes a very pessimistic view of life. It's basically viewing life without God and saying if that's the case, then effectively we're no different from the animals, because he says man's fate is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Man has no advantage in that view over the animal. All go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust all return. But that's only half the story, because as we've seen, the Bible goes further to show that although that's the wisdom of man, God says that we have an exalted position in creation. We're not just a higher level animal, as the evolutionists will tell us. We are made in the image of God. We have a soul, a spirit, and we are the crown of God's creation, the culmination of creation week. And so although we're one of countless millions of created life forms, we're also unique and special to God, and only man was created in the image of God on a separate occasion. And so again, I'll remind you that being created in the divine image is to be endowed with responsibility. God is a caretaker, so we ought to be caretakers too. And so we need to take that into account. God ordained us to be stewards over nature and over non-human life. We should have the same concern that we are told that God is. We need to care for it, protect it, maintain it, nurture it, and in a sense, we need to save it from exploitation and abuse. We are told in Scripture that God even cares for what might seem to be insignificant animals. Jesus made that point. He said, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, and not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father?" God knows when a little insignificant sparrow falls to the ground. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, and not one of them is forgotten before God? So there we see that God cares for these animals that maybe some people think there's nothing if you just go shoot one of them or kill them, or maybe that's some sort of a sport to some people, but it says that they're important to God. They're not insignificant in his eyes. Animals rely on God to sustain life. Job 12 verse 10 says, "In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind." And so the Bible repeatedly tells us that wild animals have a food source that God provides. Despite their capacity, like us, to plan adequately, they still have a food source. Because the birds, Jesus said, they don't have the capacity to plan. Okay, he says they neither sow nor reap nor gather in barns like we do. He says, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Psalm 147 verse 9, "It is he who gives an animal its food and feeds young ravens that cry." Job 38:41, "Who provides food for the raven when its young ones cry to God?" And Psalm 104 is a whole section there devoted to the fact that God loves and appreciates nature, and how he prepared nature to support plant and animal life. And so it mentions a whole lot of forest animals and wild animals, showing how all of them depend on God for their sustenance. Let's just read some of that and just see some of the animals that are mentioned. It says that God makes springs pour water into the ravines. It flows between the mountains, speaking about, nature. They give water to all the beasts of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. The birds of the air nest by their waters. They sing among the branches. The trees of the Lord are well watered, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. There the birds make their nests. The stork has its home in the pine trees. The high mountains belong to the wild goats. The crags are a refuge for the conies. You bring darkness, it becomes night, and all the beasts of the forest prowl. The lions roar for their prey and seek their food from God. How many are your works, O Lord? In your wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. They belong to God. There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. These all look to you to give their food at the proper time. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are satisfied with good things. So speaking here poetically, obviously, but showing that God is not only the creator of life, he created a system whereby through nature and through man, because we have been given stewardship, the animals are fed. Because while God ensures that the wild animals have food, he expects you to feed your dog, okay, right, and your bird. We need to feed domesticated animals. Proverbs 27:23 says, know well the condition of your flocks and give attention to your herds. Didn't know that was in the Bible, did you? There, God's telling you to look after your animals. Deuteronomy 25 verse 4 from the Amplified says, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. Now, we know that is used in the New Testament to show the principle of, the fact that people who are involved in ministry deserve support. But the original thing was showing that you mustn't prevent the ox from eating some of the grain. You're using the ox to work, so he has a right to eat some of the grain. Don't starve the animal while making it work. And God, when he gives his Sabbath instructions, he also shows his care for animals. During the 7th year, let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then let the poor among your people get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. So there, when the land was left fallow, not only the people, the poor, were able to benefit, even the wild animals were expected to benefit. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. So don't chase away the animals in the Sabbath year. Caring for the animals is a hallmark of the righteous, we are told. Proverbs 12 verse 10 says, the righteous care for the needs of the animals. So if you neglect your animals, it's a sign that you're not righteous. And so we are told that animals need to be rested. Once again, the Sabbath principle is applied not just to man. 6 days you shall do your work, it says in Exodus, but on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest. Jacob, we find, wasn't prepared to drive his livestock too hard. And so when he's reunited with his brother Esau, and he's told to join him as they sort of journey along, he says, no, you go ahead, I'll go at a different pace. He says, I must care for the ewes and the cows that are nursing their young. If they are driven hard just one day, all the animals will die. So let my Lord go on ahead of his servant, while I move along slowly at the pace of the flocks, and herds behind me and the pace of the children. So Jacob says, I can't go as fast as you can, because for the benefit of the animals and the children, I need to go slower. The Israelites were also told to offer assistance to anyone who was trying to help an animal in distress. So rescuing animals in distress is a good thing. The fireman climbing up the tree to get the cat down, he's doing God's work. Deuteronomy 22 verse 4 says, you shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen down by the way and ignore them. You shall help him to lift them up again. So if you see an animal in distress and you want to help, that's God's work. Not talking about your one. He says your brother's donkey. Okay. In fact, they're told to do this even if the animal was owned by the enemy. And they knew that. They went to say, well, it's my enemy's animal. I'm not going to help there. If you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you fallen down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help them with it. It's not the animal's fault that you got a squabble with its owner. Even the self-righteous Pharisees, Jesus said they would break the Sabbath to rescue an animal in distress. He actually uses that against them because they were upset that Jesus healed people. And he says, but you even will break the Sabbath to help an animal. Jesus said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, are you going to say, well, it's a Sabbath, I can't help the sheep? He says, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? Breaking the Sabbath. And he says something similar in Luke 14:15 about an ox that has fallen into a well, saying that you, who supposedly never break the Sabbath, will break the Sabbath to help an animal in distress. Animals must be afforded shelter and protection. We know that David was called a man after God's own heart. You know that he risked his life for that of a sheep. You might say, well, a sheep's not that important. I don't mind risking my life for my family, but for the life of a sheep? Well, he goes up against a lion, and a bear for the sake of a sheep. David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, David didn't say, well, write that off. I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if it arose against me, I caught him by the beard and struck him and killed him. David defended, these animals that needed protection, even a sheep. And he was a man after God's own heart. And so it's interesting that Jesus actually uses the love of a shepherd for his sheep to teach us about his love for a lost sinner. He says, my love for the lost sinner is the same as a shepherd loves his sheep. How much does Jesus love the lost sinner? He loves them a lot. Okay, and just as David, as that shepherd, would take on the wild animal that was trying to hurt the sheep, so Jesus loves the lost sinner. Jesus said, what man of you having 100 sheep, if he's lost one of them, does not leave the 99? Once again, 1 out of 99, that's 1%. He doesn't just write it off. Jesus said that shepherd would go after the one that is lost until he finds it. And when he has found it, he places it on his shoulder and he rejoices. He's excited that he's saved that one sheep. When he comes home, he calls his friends and his neighbors and he throws a party. Okay, rejoice with me. And Jesus said that's the same way, obviously, that the angels rejoice when they hear that one of the lost has come to salvation. But the interesting thing is the analogy he's using to these people. He's saying, you know how much you love your animals, and that's how much I love the lost sinner. In fact, when he calls himself the good shepherd, he talks about a good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. Imagine the kind of shepherd like David who's prepared to die for a sheep. And Jesus said, I'm the good shepherd, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And look at the tender terms that Jesus uses when he speaks of the love between an animal and by its keeper. Very tender. In John 10, verse 3-4, Jesus says, the sheep hear his voice. That's the shepherd. And he calls his own sheep by name. He's named them all. Those 100 sheep, he knows them apart and he knows their names. And he leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes before them. And the sheep follow him, for they know his voice, showing a level of intimacy. And so, I just want to mention, though, the differences, once again, between biblical environmentalism, in terms of stewardship for nature, and the way that a lot of these modern movements have deviated. And so we get what's called deep ecology. And they basically embrace what we call a pantheistic worldview. The pantheists view all life as being part of God. So unlike monotheists like us who believe in one creator God, or polytheists who believe in a whole lot of gods, the pantheist says, well, everything's God. The tree is God, the dog is part of God. And so they view all life as equally sacred. And effectively, that analogy has been drawn with the deep ecology movement, because they say, well, all nature is equally important to man, which is not what the Bible teaches. That clashes with the biblical view of human uniqueness. And so some extremists actually have advocated reproductive policies such as more access to abortion with environmental sustainability. We're getting too populated. We need to have more abortion. They argue that limiting population growth of humans can reduce pressure on natural resources. Ken was also, I think, mentioning about the fact, saving the eggs of the turtle, and, but you're happy to kill the baby in the womb. Some support controversial measures, including sterilization programs. This is what they're advocating for. Or restrictions on reproductive rights. If you're not too sure what that's all about, part of it is they want to remove the requirement where you need permission from either a parent or your partner to access abortion. They want it to be easier for people to abort, because after all, there's too many people. And so we have groups like Earth First, the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement. Okay, the latter have promoted radical ideas on population control. They've actually argued that humans should voluntarily choose not to have children. So fortunately, they haven't yet proposed euthanasia, but they've said, well, just don't have kids, and we can voluntarily become extinct and supposedly save the planet. But part of God's plan for preserving the planet was man. If you take away man, the animals aren't going to do better, and nature is not going to go better. Because God's injunction to man in Genesis 1:28 was to be fruitful and multiply. And he gives the same command we see to the animals. So it is not God's plan to voluntarily go extinct. And so as we come to an end, just to put this in perspective, before you think that I'm advocating that you go lie in the road now, or go throw soup on paintings, okay? Man, according to the Bible, has a right to use nature. So even though he has authority to rule over it and to look after it, he also has a right to use it. And so it says in Psalm 115, verse 16, the heavens are the Lord's, but the earth he has given to the children of the men, in the sense that we are able to use the resources. We can eat the plants. We can even eat the animals where needs be, but don't kill animals needlessly. So I have a problem with hunting for sport only. If it's in order to feed people, or perhaps there's some sort of a problem with overpopulation, maybe you can justify it then. But to needlessly kill animals, I don't think is endorsed by the biblical principle of stewardship. Nature, we are told, is to provide also for human needs. Genesis 1 verse 29, God says to man, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be yours for food. So you don't have to choose to go voluntarily extinct because you're eating vegetables and fruit. God has allowed you to do that. And so my final slide, I believe, is that God values nature. You've seen it. You probably weren't aware of all the scriptures there were on the fact of how much God values nature, independent of people, but not above people. And that's the difference with secular environmentalism. Mankind is unique. Because Jesus, remember I told you how he cares for the fields, for nature, how he cares for the insignificant sparrow. And he says, look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds, and they're important. But he goes on to say, are you not much more valuable than they? That's his point he's making. Yes, they're valuable to God. He looks after them, but you are more valuable. So remember, I told you before, you're a pearl of great price, a hidden treasure. Well, here once again, Jesus says you're valuable, despite you might think you're not. Matthew 12, verse 12, once again, the point that Jesus makes to the Pharisees, how much valuable is a man than a sheep? Remember when he said, if your sheep falls into, a pit, aren't you going to rescue him and break the Sabbath? He says, well, man is more valuable than a sheep. Why can't I heal a man on the Sabbath? And then finally, Matthew 10, verse 31, in closing, don't be afraid, Jesus said, you are worth more than many sparrows. So the God who is concerned when a little sparrow, seemingly insignificant, falls down, Jesus said, he's even more concerned about you. You are worth more than many sparrows. So that's the biblical perspective on our attitude to the environment, to animals, but also the difference between us and the modern movement that puts man on the same level as a sheep or a turtle, or even lower than a turtle, from what Ken was telling us as well. Even the turtles are above us according to them, but God says, you are much more valuable than a sparrow. You're much more valuable than a sheep, and he loves the sparrow and the sheep. Amen. Let's close with this song. You're valuable to God. Before the world began, you were on his mind. Every tear you cry is precious in his eyes.